welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us this afternoon for our seminar on spirituality, sustainability and style. My name is Ellen Rowley and I'm an architectural historian based in the School of Architecture in University College Dublin, Ireland, with research interests in Catholic modernism and the architecture of everyday life. I'm convening today's session and hoping to keep everything running smoothly. I wanted to mention some housekeeping. So we'll all stay on mute except for the speaker who's speaking, and we might turn our cameras off again, except for the speaker. There's an opportunity for you, the audience, to engage and participate through the chat box or the chat mechanism. So if you don't mind putting your thoughts and comments and questions into that, we'll endeavour to share those with each of our, or with our speakers at the end of each session. So just to say then that we're running this webinar in two chunks, if you like, two sessions. Session one has 3 speakers and they will speak, and then we will break for discussion at the end of the 3 presentations. And session 2 comprises 4 speakers. And again, we will run through all 4 presentations, each one roughly 10 minutes long, and we'll stop for discussion at the end of the session. We don't have much time. We're all at once hyper-local and hyper-global, completely connected through Zoom from different parts of the world. It's really amazing. So in the interest of hearing as many of these voices as possible, I have to be a rigorous timekeeper, something I'm not actually great at. Anyway, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Cardinal Jean-Claude Hollerich, Bishop of Luxembourg, who's generously introducing this webinar. Cardinal Hollerich has served as the Archbishop of Luxembourg since 2011. He has been the president of the Commission of the Bishops' Conferences of the European Union, COMECE, C-O-M-E-C-E, since March 2018. He also became a member of the Pontifical Council for Culture in early 2020, therefore making him the ideal person to open our proceedings, given that this webinar, this gathering, is an initiative and collaboration of COMECE and the Pontifical Council for Culture. So Cardinal Hollerich, over to you. Thank you.
So thank you, dear Dr. Ellen Rowley, for opening our webinar on spirituality, sustainability and style. I feel honored to say a few words of introduction. This webinar is a contribution to the new European Bauhaus initiative of the European Commission. Therefore, it is with great pleasure that we will listen to Mr. Troussard from the European Commission, who will present the initiative in more detail to us. If I understood correctly, the basic idea of the new European Bauhaus is to promote solutions for an ecological transition which are sustainable, inclusive, and beautiful, insisting on the beauty of nature so that our admiration for it may direct our attitudes, and behavior is a familiar topic in our Christian tradition. Father Umberto Albrosio, by the way, professor at the Luxembourg School for Religion and Society, will discuss it with respect to the encyclical letter Laudato Si. And Professor Anna Minta will speak to us about the Christian reception of the initial Bauhaus movement and the modernist movement in general. In a second session, we will then follow a more practical approach to our quest for sustainable and inclusive houses, places, and cities, which also respond to the spiritual aspirations of people. I am sure that Philip Bess, Anna Ledinger, Demas Nkoko, and Marie-Yvonne Proveaux will tell us to their stories that such houses, places, and cities must be beautiful. Thanks to all of you already. And I feel very happy to have this connection between nature and culture, because as you know, the two concepts are closely related. Nature is always culturally defined, and culture again gets influence from its own definition of nature. Our webinar will be concluded by Bishop Paul Tighe. He is the Secretary of the Pontifical Council for Culture. Thank you, Bishop Paul. Being President of COMECE, the Commission of EU Bishops, and member of the Pontifical Council for Culture, will understand that I'm really happy about this joint event of both organizations. When thinking about what may inspire our conversations today, I came up with two ideas which I would like to share with you. The first point, nature is beautiful. Nature, this concept of nature, I think many of you will agree with this short sentence. But in human history, this wasn't always the case. If you read Goethe's trip to Italy, he doesn't lose a single word about the Alps. He just didn't see them. He wasn't impressed by them. So this was before Romanticism, of course. For centuries, nature was mostly perceived as dangerous, threatening, and thus ugly. How did the change come about? While following on the very interesting analysis of Jörg Lauster in his Cultural History of Christianity, an important agent of change was St. Francis of Assisi. His poetic praise of nature, as composed, for example, in the Canticle of the Sun, can be seen as a turning point, a game changer in our cultural history. The Franciscan spirit drove a fundamental change in mentality, which initiated an appreciation of the naturally beautiful and an affirmation of the here and now for religious reasons. Apprehending the central role of St. Francis allows us, therefore, I think, a better understanding of the centrality of Pope Francis' Laudato Si, the encyclical letter on ecology, integral ecology. Admiring the beauty of nature and working for its preservation through sustainability and inclusiveness have become a central feature of Christian life. Second point, beauty flows from contemplation. Design solutions which are functioning and beautiful are the result of a proper creative process in which a period of distancing and inwardness is crucial. In our Catholic tradition, there are many examples for this. One is the Order of the Visitation. It was founded in the early 17th century by Saint Jean-Marie de Chantal and another Francis, Saint François de Sales. After some discussion, the Visitation Sisters became a contemplative order. It grew rapidly with many foundations all over the world. Contemplation and sobriety became the hallmark of their lifestyle. But their inner life, their spiritual life, was so rich and enthusiastic that it allowed for an outbreak of an unprecedented collective creativity in arts and craftsmanship, especially around textiles. Currently, the numbers of the orders are declining, and one monastery after the other has to close its doors definitely. But the sisters made a wise decision. They decided to collect their most beautiful treasures in one single place, in a small museum, the home city of Stefan Lunte in Moulins in France. To the amazement of its many visitors, as an inexhaustible source of inspiration for fashion designers, they come regularly to this museum to discover the collections. The beauty of nature is revealed to us through contemplation. Contemplation is the source of beauty and functionality in design, architecture, and urban planning. Maybe this is something we should bear in mind when we consider the new European Bauhaus, which has already gathered so much public attention. Dear speakers, thank you so much for your involvement. And thank you, dear participants, for your interest in our webinar. Thank you.
Sorry, did we lose connection there?
Yeah, but you're back in now.
Was that only me? I'm really sorry. I seem to have lost connection. I'm terribly sorry. Have you finished, Cardinal? Apologies for that. Okay, so thank you for that overview of what's ahead and that reminder of St. Francis of Assisi's profound example to us all. It's terribly interesting and timely coming together this afternoon in light of Ursula von der Leyen's call for greater awareness of the links between design and climate change. The Catholic Church, as we know, has been a singular patron of architecture across the world over time, making monumental structures and barely visible everyday social infrastructures alike. But what direction will and should this patronage take from 2021? Certainly my own research around pre and post conciliar church buildings is looking at the problematic of architectural obsolescence, both material and cultural, whereby these vast mid-20th century Catholic churches are out of scale, some say out of time, and no longer fit for purpose. Our project, Making Dust, is a reflection at the start of a process of deconsecration and demolition across Ireland, which itself is a very peripheral place on the edge of Europe. So as we struggle today with the implications of the Anthropocene, that the world and nature are just an extension of our modern technologized civilization, many climate change advocates propose degrowth as the only solution. And so how can new architecture be built? Indeed, this is one big question for the new European Bauhaus. So taking the three pillars of the new European Bauhaus as our lead this afternoon, that is inclusivity, beauty, sustainability, our first session is organized by three disciplines of theology, design history, and contemporary policy. Our first speaker represents the Theology Pillar and will reflect upon Pope Francis's Encyclical. Father Alberto Fabio Ambrosio is Professor of Theology and History of Religions at the Luxembourg School of Religion and Society and Director of Research at the Collège des Bernardins in Paris. He has been researching around Ottoman and Turkish Islam, publishing prolifically on Islam, Sufism, and interreligious dialogue, such as Penser l'Islam en Europe, edited with Laurent Mignon in 2021, and last year, Liberté de religion et de conviction en Méditerranée. Most recently, and we'll get a glimpse in today's presentation, Professor Father Ambrosio's research has turned to dress and fashion as a system of religious identity. He has a book in press on theology of fashion, and he is also the director of an Italian and French series on aesthetics and spirituality. So thank you, Father Ambrosio. The title of your presentation is Building Ecological Aesthetics for Everyday Life.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ellen, and I would like to thank especially the Pontifical Council for Culture and the COMECE's president. Thank you very much for this invitation that is very inspiring. In spite of explicit philosophical or theological aesthetics in the Laudato Si encyclical letter of Pope Francis, we can find some interesting points in order to build a model of aesthetics bringing together sustainability, spirituality, and of course, art. As a matter of fact, if we look carefully at the scheme of the letter, we can focus on similar points that were very important in the Bauhaus approach. We can easily find some analogies in ways of seeing reality. I would like to underline here three main points in order to draft a model of aesthetics in everyday life in terms of sustainability. The first chapter, the first chapter of the letter of Pope Francis, Laudato Si, is titled, "What is happening to our common home?" And it is referring to the crisis of the contemporary world. Pope Francis highlights the four elements that are burning the common home. And the first two are extremely important: pollution and climate change, and the issue of water. I don't want at all to enter into details, but to stay at the level of structure of the letter, and because there is not an explicit model of aesthetics in the letter, I would like to try to take inspiration from some elements for my current purposes. As a matter of fact, the expression, "what is happening to our common home," is very appropriate because Europe is also defined as the common home of Europe, of course. We probably might reflect on the fact that Pope Francis, in writing on the care of the common home, was also thinking of this other expression referring to Europe. A very interesting detail is the fact that this is the first letter of Pope Francis, which is not just addressed to the bishops, to the priests or deacons, or just to consecrated persona and the lay faithful on faith, as, for example, on an apostolic exhortation such as Evangelii Gaudium. Here, as well as Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis wants to consider a key universal challenge. By talking about the common home, even the letter is in a way common and so addressed to everybody. Here, the idea, we can common home cannot to let us think about the idea of Europe as a common home. This is my first point, that this letter is maybe also referring of the common home that is Europe. Implicitly, we may say that Pope Francis is addressing, first of all, national and, of course, economic, to bring about change. But from a simple look to the world situation, we understand that there are some nations that are wasting more and faster than others. So our reflection must be confused, first of all, where these purposes are contemporary problems. What is happening to our common home could thus be interpreted as what is happening to Europe in building this home for Europeans, of course, as well as this common home that is the planet. Behind the ambiguity of the origin of the expression common home, used in meanwhile for Europe and of course for the planet, there is an invitation to Europe in order to build this model of an ecological aesthetic for everyday life. Second point, in fact, paragraph 149 of the letters highlights at the same time the extreme poverty of some people in the world and the fact that in order to build a relationship of unity, love proves powerful. Two things merit our attention here. Extreme poverty is often associated with a lack of space for people. Both harmonic space and, of course, functional living space. Harmonic and functional space, important elements of the Bauhaus movement, are two important attributes in transforming exploitative and violent behaviors into those that contribute to developing a culture of the neighborhood. We have seen and we still observe that in the pandemic crisis, the sense and the meaning of space is a radical ingredient in developing a new perspective for a new world. We are going further to both a local sense of space and also a more ethereal world connection by the internet system or World Wide Web. Well, the local, the house, the intimate space, as well as the private space that is linked with other spaces cannot anymore be conceived as a tool of domination, or better said, discrimination. Bauhaus seems to bring focus to this relationship between function and a certain artistic sobriety, a model of aesthetics of living space, or more precisely, of the everyday living space, is the precondition of a real and democratic society. If Europe doesn't respect this law, the alternative, as Pope Francis explicitly says, is to create the conditions for violent behavior. The aesthetics, as a result, must not just be the prerogative of an elite, although there will probably be an elite's aesthetics. Instead, if isn't grounded in the everyday life of everyone, the destiny of Europe as well as the entire world will be to experience more and more violence. As a matter of fact, as you know, the aesthetics of everyday life is a quite new field in philosophical aesthetics. And we can also surmise that these everyday life aesthetics in space, design, vehicles, and clothing could also contribute to a renewal of the common home. The third point is a development of this everyday life aesthetics in the light of Laudato Si. In the same paragraph 149, Pope Francis writes about weaving bonds of belonging and togetherness. Working on a theology of dress and fashion, as Ellen said, and more widely in building the new discipline of or branch of fashion and religions, there is an extremely important field that Pope Francis touches on in an implicit way. The expression weaving bonds of togetherness and belonging is a way to create a model of everyday life's aesthetics, a democratic aesthetics. These aesthetics, and I think about the aesthetics of fashion and dress, is basic, even in times of pandemic, because we are talking about the basic fact that everyone in the office or the home is dressed in clothes. Well, the phrase weaving bonds highlights that in our life, the foundation of any harmony must be woven. This verb is not insignificant at all, because the title of the last encyclical letter of Francis is Fratelli Tutti. Relations are expressed today in fashion terms. And we know that Bauhaus is not just an architectural movement, but its aesthetics also addresses textile and clothing, and particularly through a female approach to the application of Bauhaus principles in textile realm, as some studies prove. There is in the Bauhaus movement what in theological and Christian terms we might call an incarnational principle, because its ideas don't just focus on the architectural aesthetics, but permeates all dimensions of everyday life. In architectural, as well in fashion and dress, the ecological dimension is more and more an urgent issue, especially for younger generations. We have here where here means not only Pope Francis' inspirational point, but also the insights of the Bauhaus movement and the urgent concerns of the younger generation, 3 points for building a model of aesthetics. First one, the ecology as the aesthetics of the planet, our common home. If Europe doesn't take into consideration more and more the ecological dimension of the survival of both humans and the planet, will there be any future for the common home, considered as the planet as well as Europe and within both future generations? Second one, the aesthetics in human experience, so for everyone. The everyday life aesthetics is the field, something democratic, where both citizens and human beings can experience the weaving of bonds of togetherness and belonging. Well, it is an image, but if the institutions don't work on weaving relations, any Europe or any aesthetics of Europe will not be created. Third point, finally, the aesthetics of dress and fashion could be something for everybody, because every day we wear products that are often only possible because of the exploitation of the labor of poor people or a lack of respect for both the planet and its inhabitants. The ethics of fashion is a concrete way where aesthetics joins ethics, where the habitant joins our habits, or perhaps the opposite makes more sense. This is where our habits, in the sense of wearing and sourcing clothes, intersects with the habitat, the planet. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Father. And you made it just in time in 11 minutes. That was fantastic. What a beautiful discourse. Weaving, if I can say, quite literally and figuratively. And probably, yes, clothing is as everyday and as reciprocal as architecture, as essential to the everyday. So I'd just like to remind everybody that you can put a question into the chat, and we will address at the end of the three speakers' presentations. There's already one in there for COMECE. So now I'd like to welcome and introduce our second speaker. Anna Minta is an architectural historian of renown. She is Professor of History and Theory of Architecture at the Catholic Privat University in Linz, Austria, where she's also the Dean of the Faculty of Philosophy and Art Sciences. Her research interests are many and rich, having specialized in the architectural development of Israel from the late 1940s until through to 1967. More recently, she published State Buildings and Sacred Architecture in Washington, D.C. Today, though, Professor Minta has been invited to consider the Christian reception or response to the original early 20th century Bauhaus, which in a way contextualizes the initiative of the new European Bauhaus, reminding us of that exemplary radical ideological situation that was the original Bauhaus in Weimar, Germany from 1919, later in Dessau, and then closing in Berlin in 1933. Professor Anna Minta, thank you.
Well, thank you very much for this nice introduction. And of course, thank you very much to the organizers for this invitation. It's an honor to participate. Also, I have to admit that I had two irritations or maybe two reluctances when I was invited. The first one is the title, New European Bauhaus. At least for an architectural historian, it evokes ambivalent associations in reference to aesthetics and social design ambitions. The historical Bauhaus of the 1920s developed a rather normative and hegemonic concept of design. And with its unbroken belief in functionalism and technology, it paid only little interest in environmental concerns and spiritual values. And then furthermore, being asked to talk about Christian reception of the Bauhaus, well, I can quickly summarize that there was no explicit Christian reception, as much as there was no explicit quest for spiritual qualities in the Bauhaus design theories. So nevertheless, the invitation is very attractive, and I try to kind of elaborate about these two topics. I want to focus on, or I want to relate the historical Bauhaus to the New European Bauhaus initiative, and I search for interfaces with the Laudato Si calls for care of our common home and the whole human family. So what does the European Commission's President Ursula von der Leyen has in mind when she talks about the New European Bauhaus? Which Bauhaus is she referring to? In a recent newspaper article, she describes the Bauhaus as an institution of global influence, developing interdisciplinary and comprehensive approaches in physically, aesthetically, and ideologically transforming the human environment. adjusting it to the conditions of the modern industrial society at the beginning of the 20th century. Von der Leyen uses the Bauhaus as a model for a common effort, uniting sciences, technology, ecology, and humanism in order to develop creative concepts for a modern and a future life. A life that responds to the challenges of radical industrialization and globalization, or global capitalism, and to counteract to the climate crisis and social inequalities and injustices. So indeed, in its only 15 years of existence, so from 1918 to 1933, the Bauhaus became a powerful institution for art and architectural reform as an integral part of a comprehensive aesthetic concept for the design environment. Through its teachings and productions, and through its students and later emigres, the Bauhaus exceeded global influence, and as much as other concepts of modern architecture. So I see it a bit complicated to only focus on the Bauhaus, but we have to see the modern architecture movements in total. I do agree with von der Leyen's call for a Green Deal as a cultural project that needs to address not only ecological and economical questions, but also has to develop social concepts and visions. The papal encyclical Laudato Si from 2015 corresponds with this comprehensive approach for forming society and its built environment, even though it hardly addresses design questions. So why am I critical about the adequacy of the name European Bauhaus? The Bauhaus itself was not monolithic. It developed dynamically, changed ideologies and conceptions according to its varying teachers and students. The Foundation Manifesto of 1918, which you see to your left, defines architecture as the ultimate goal of all art. It talks about the spirit of architecture, calls for a return to craftsmanship, and unfolds the vision of, I quote, new buildings of the future that will unite every discipline, architecture, sculpture, and painting, and which will one day rise heavenwards from the million hands of craftsmen as a clear symbol of the new belief to come, end of quote. By this wording, and before the background of the brutal experiences of World War I, we can observe a rather romantic backlash, somehow rejecting modernity and industrialization. The title illustration by Lionel Feininger, showing a cathedral and a star spreading light into all directions, stands for the romanticization of pre-industrial times and the spiritual impact of building the human environment. And to show that this is not only specific to the Bauhaus, but was very common, widespread at that time, I have another illustration by Bruno Taut, which is not related to the Bauhaus, and published a book at the same time, 1919, called The Stadtkrone, City Crown. And also he uses the image of the Holy Barbara to demonstrate this kind of idealistic romanticization of the medieval times for sort of a harmonized community. So when the Bauhaus Manifesto talks about the new building of the future as a clear symbol of a new belief to come, and a community free of divisive class pretensions, we might easily compare to Pope Francis' writings in Laudato Si of the common home and the whole human family. The Bauhaus calls for a multidisciplinary approach as much as the Pope addresses all disciplines and social forces for a common creative dialogue. However, in reference to technology and progress, we observe major differences. In 1923, the Bauhaus fundamentally changed the program, for which the director, Walter Gropius, coined the slogan, "Art and Technology, a New Unity." He did not only envision an intensive cooperation between design and industry, merging art with mass production, but called for a rational, functional approach in designing the human environment in total. His successor as director, Hannes Meyer, even went further in rationalizing and measuring human life and habits to develop normative principles for design, housing, and urban planning. This Bauhaus stands for an unquestionable belief in technology and progress, without references to natural resources or human concerns. And we can easily subsume it under Pope Francis' critique of a Promethean vision of mastery over the world by its excessive anthropocentrism. This also stands in contrast to the new European Bauhaus intentions to balance unlimited industrialization in favor of a sustainable human-built environment that provides for high aesthetic and just social standards. So then what about the possible Christian response to the Bauhaus? The Bauhaus teachings did not officially address religious beliefs of spirituality, except maybe in the short period until 1933, under the Swiss artist and teacher Johannes Itten, which you see here. Itten believed in Mazda's-Nan, a Neo-Zoroastrian religion, which is concerned with personal health, emotion, and behavior. But by integrating religious spiritual beliefs into his teachings, he got in conflict with the rationalist director Gropius, and he had to leave the Bauhaus. So nevertheless, despite the Bauhaus' outspoken functionalist and therefore also anti-religious position, we can observe an influence of the Bauhaus, or maybe better in general of the modernist movements, onto Christian reform movements at the beginning of the 20th century. When modern architects worked on new concepts for the human habitat, it included ambitions in social reforms. And similarly, in discussing church architecture, it was inherent to form a nucleus for a new Christian society. So what might be the impulses provided by the Bauhaus teaching? And I sort of have a short list. It's abstraction and reduction to the quintessential and to the minimalist. Principles of equality and mutuality versus the established and unquestioned hierarchies. The concept of wholeness, wholeness of life, of people, and of the designed environment. And the demand to live in the present and to develop reform concept for the future. So when we look at reform movements within Catholicism, like in the 1920s, or also around the Second Vaticanum, or in today's Laudato Si, we find influences of aesthetic as well as of social aspects. And I just show an example or two examples by Rudolf Schwarz. The architect Rudolf Schwarz has no affiliations with the Bauhaus, but I sort of want to take it as the overhaul of the modern movement. And Rudolf Schwarz even criticized the Bauhaus after the Second World War for its rational and functionalist approach. But we can see this radical reduction to the minimalist, the acceptance of modernity and the modern condition with modern materials, and in designing an environment which focused on the community. So this might be the consensus between the Bauhaus, the new European Bauhaus, and Laudato Si. They all have in common a fundamental understanding of spatial social theories that define a close and mutual relation of human behavior and the built environment. At all times, the historical Bauhaus was deeply convinced to support forming a new society by physically and aesthetically designing a modern environment. In multidisciplinary experiments, the Bauhaus, as much as other modern movements, explored state-of-the-art building practices and developed utopian architectural, urban, and social visions in order to compensate existing injustice in its time. And this is sort of just an illustration to show that we have in many countries modern movements which have these ambitions to create modern, new, and identity-serving architecture. So therefore, speaking in the name of the Bauhaus, I want to conclude. We need to critically question existing value systems, conventions, and traditions. We need to break with established categories and normative settings, and we need to explore the fundamentals and the basics. We need to analyze our built environment and its social potential, not only to practically respond to demands of sustainability and natural resources or in climate awareness, but to embody qualities like respect, justice, and equality among people as much as between man and nature. We need to create spaces that integrate and share identity. And we need to develop environments that appreciate cultural and social diversity. So in a nutshell, we need to talk about architecture and urban design, as well as ecological and social reform at the same time. Thank you.
really beautifully and artfully summed up. I mean, to bring that consensus together, where I was lost, you've really enlightened me in these connections. So let's hold that thought and move on to the third speaker. Thank you so much, Anna Minta. We are honoured to have Xavier Troussard here as our third speaker, and indeed providing the last presentation of the first session. To remind you all to put questions into the chat facility, and we'll go through it all after this presentation. So since December 2020, really just the other day, Xavier Troussard has been leading, sorry, just want to turn that timer off. Xavier Troussard has been leading the new European Bauhaus unit created at the EU Joint Research Centre, with the background education in law, general administration and European studies from Rennes and Bruges. He has been working in areas around EU cultural policy and diversity. Since 2014, he has been with the Joint Research Centre creating and leading the development of the EU Policy Lab, which is a lab, a fascinating space and forum looking into all sorts of crucial, critical, everyday issues, from food poverty to blockchain technologies and more. Today, Xavier Troussard is introducing us to the new European Bauhaus, which is pretty much why we're here, or rather has catalyzed our coming together. The new European Bauhaus is a co-creation initiative intended to be this bridge between sciences, technologies and arts, culture, design, to meet the expectations of citizens for new forms of living together. And as they put it, it is to be both a think tank and a do tank. So with that in mind, thank you, Xavier Troussard.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rowley, and good afternoon to everybody. I would like first to thank the organizers for their interest in the new European Bauhaus in the first place, and for inviting me to share some elements with you. I would like also to thank the previous speakers for making the connections between the Encyclical Laudato Si and the new European Bauhaus, and as well for this critical review of the links, but also the major disconnections between the old and the new European Bauhaus. So Mrs. van der Leyen, the Commission's president, announced this concept, or launched this concept of the new European Bauhaus last September in front of the Parliament in a State of the Union speech. We were already a few months in the middle of the COVID-19 crisis, and she probably had in mind that we would need soon a project, a space for Europeans to think about how they would like to live together after the pandemics. And I think this togetherness is one of the first elements behind this initiative. The second element, of course, is the defining moment of our time. It's the climate urgency and the ambition of Europe to become the first climate neutral continent by 2050, the so-called Green Deal. So the so-called Green Deal is very often looked at through the eyes of technology and economy. But if it has to succeed, it has to become, believes the President of the Commission, a real cultural project for Europe. Because we will only get to this transformation if it becomes a positive, tangible, concrete experience for everybody in its daily life. So it's about changing fundamentally our paradigm, but changing also our environment. So it is a design challenge, and that's where the link with the Bauhaus is crucial. The Bauhaus is known for coining a motto for design, which is still considered by many as being valid. The forms follow function. But the belief is that now we've got to go beyond. The motto has to be deeply revisited to make sure that we can factor in the limits of the planet and we can aim at higher social ends. And that's where I can fully agree with the numerous discrepancies that Professor Minta has been identifying. So in this new design to be developed, we need to bring, again, people together from various perspectives, from various backgrounds, for various fields of knowledge and experience. And we need also perhaps a new way to develop the project at European level. So you need maybe some form of innovation to make sure that citizens have an opportunity to play a role in shaping this new design. So concretely, the project aims at focusing on the space of our daily life. These neighborhoods, these villages where the global challenges can find solutions that improve our lives. So it's rural areas, it's urban areas. This is the public space as well as your house. This is the place where you work. And it is also the life you have there. Professor Ambrosio spoke about fashion. We could speak about transport. We could speak about food. The way we live is intimately linked to the spaces. And so this is the scope. Within this scope, the design challenge is to combine three fundamental guiding principles. The first one, of course, is sustainability. And when we listen to what people tell us, sustainability is not only reducing the emissions to meet our climate targets, but it's also dealing with pollution, which is affecting our health. It's also dealing with biodiversity. And in the end, this is fundamentally rethinking our relationship with nature. And I think this is something which is coming very strongly in what we're listening to. The second guiding principle is inclusion. This is not a project for the few. We need to find solutions that are affordable for the many, and we need to think about developing an environment which is accessible to all. With our aging population, with people with disabilities, we have to make sure that we have a living environment which is conceived for all. The third dimension we call often aesthetics, but it's broader. I think it is recognizing that people have aspirations beyond functionality. They are looking for sense of belonging. They are looking for identity, local identities that are linked to heritage, to tradition, to local craft, or even local materials. And more generally, they aspire to certain aspects of quality of life that we have to cater for on top of the functionality, the inclusion and the sustainability. So I think within this triangle, the new European Bauhaus initiatives aim at driving a number of forces across society to have an impact on transforming the places, but also transforming the enabling conditions, that is the industrial ecosystems that are attached to places, in particular the construction ecosystem, but some others too, and the markets, which are ways to make affordable solutions available to all. And fundamentally, the last area of impact that we want to have is on the mindset, is on the culture, and to get this deep change in the way we approach the relationship with nature, the relationship to togetherness, and the relationship with our environment. We have decided to develop this project in a different way than we normally do at European level. Normally, the Commission comes with a comprehensive concept in a document, and then the Parliament and the Council discuss it, people make comments. Here we have started to have a much more open invitation for people to co-create this initiative with us, what we call the design phase. And what we are collecting at the moment are inspiring examples for the new European Bauhaus, are visions or ideas about what this movement should be, what it could bring, or what it should bring, but also what people are struggling with, what are the main challenges, what are the obstacles, the difficulties, and the priorities people have to deal with. So that's what we are collecting. So we are collecting hundreds of those inputs, and we will progressively make sense of them to move in a delivery phase. We'll start with piloting a number of activities to look at what works, what brings a real added value. And then we will move towards disseminating what works and having a wide-ranging sharing of the best experiences. So to conclude, just I want to make sure that this conversation today is one contribution to this design phase, and so I hope that the organizers will upload the main messages on our website. And I also invite all the people that are listening to us to consider contributing, because this is a project in which everybody can contribute, and we're listening to everybody's voice. I can also mention that next week we'll have a major international conference on the 22nd and 23rd of April that you can register for, and where we will have also some in-depth exchanges with numerous experts on the topic. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Xavier Troussard. Okay, so if the three speakers might like to unmute yourselves for some questions from the this first session. There is a question for Professor Anna Minta from Clotilde Fantsa. Thank you, Professor Anna Minta, for pointing to the need to also focus on social reform as much as architecture and ecological sustainability. Do you really believe that the new European Bauhaus is in line with the original Bauhaus thinking, which was rooted in social progress, rather than the second Bauhaus movement that you described from the 30s, which was rooted more in technological developments? And this is a concern from the European Federation of National Organizations Working with the Homeless, that the new European Bauhaus, this part is probably more for Xavier Troussard, that the new European Bauhaus is not enough about inclusion and humanism, but in priority about technology and style, maybe forgetting that the core of the new European Bauhaus should be about people. So maybe Anna Minta address the first part of that comment, if you don't mind.
Yeah, thank you very much to this. It's a very important point, and actually, as Xavier Troussard just said, it's a developing process, and I think it's important that from various sides we have to focus and support this quest for social reform, and this taking it really seriously, talking about the whole people and a common home. Because I think they're too dangerous on the one hand, and this is also what the Bauhaus did. I mean, they focused on technology on the one hand, and they also had this concept of the white European people, and also they worked on social housing. They were always addressing middle classes and upper classes. So I think it's kind of an important thing to really have a broad focus on the whole society. And then also, and this is why I think it's still important to focus on the Bauhaus and also on Laudato Si, because it has to be more than just thinking about sustainable architecture and natural resources. I think this is the most complex part of this process of developing a green global idea, is the social reform. And when we think back to the 1920s, and there's this famous wording by Le Corbusier, a French architect, who said that a house must be a machine, and he said who's not understanding it will sooner or later learn it. So this is why I meant that the Bauhaus and the modern movement was very hegemonic and very normative and also authoritarian. So I think it's very important to combine this new initiative now with these social aspects, and it needs all various organizations to feed in various aspects.
Okay, thank you, Anna Minta. Xavier Troussard, have you a comment to that point at the end, that the new European Bauhaus appears to be maybe prioritizing technology and style, maybe forgetting that the core is, around this question comes from the homeless sector? Or from people helping those suffering with homelessness or in homeless state?
Thank you for the question. I mean, from the concept since the inception, I think we have a balanced approach between sustainability, inclusion, and aesthetics. And so the inclusion part is for us crucial. As I said, we are looking at making sure that the new European Bauhaus is providing solutions that for everybody. So affordability is very important, as well as probably, and things are developing in the conversations we have about also the underlying economics of the new European Bauhaus. What about gentrification? What about the housing costs and the relationship between even nice renovations, sustainable renovation and housing costs? So it's clear that we have to look at these broad social inclusion concerns when developing the transformation of the places. I think one other dimension I could stress is that when we see what people tell us, and we have more than 700 contributions yet, we see that they value a lot the community dimension. So the social aspect in terms of being together and the place making sense because it is bringing people together is also something which is very much valued. So the new European Bauhaus is certainly about the built environment, but it's also a lot about the social environment and the way both can reinforce each other in a sustainable and positive way. So clearly, I think there's the intention, but as was said, I mean, this is the project which is still in the design phase. So I would invite whoever feels that some dimensions are missing to actually contribute and put the finger on it, so that as part of our design brief, we get some stronger points on those dimensions. So you're welcome to contribute.
Okay, excellent, thank you. I'm not sure how much time we have, Stefan and Emilio. Can we ask a couple more questions or read out a few more comments? Because I understand we were to start the second session a few minutes ago, but you know, I disappeared for a minute. There is a comment actually here for COMECE referring back to the fact that this has been hosted by COMECE and the introduction by Bishop Jean-Claude. Somebody is congratulating COMECE for having this timely event and letting us know that today is the birthday of Leonardo da Vinci, reminding us of the triangle or the triad of Vitruvius, of that architecture should be structurally sound, be beautiful, and be functional. So that's that triad constantly finds its way through design, I suppose, architectural design. But the question here is, would the COMECE be interested to showcase and further promote transformation of empty buildings owned by the church into affordable housing? Again, it's the housing issue for vulnerable people, such as the homeless, as a contribution to the new European Bauhaus. And apologies from this person, they say, for being overly practical. Would COMECE respond to that, or?
I can give a short answer. I must say I like the idea, because that would mean that the church being desecrated, not being destinated for the cult anymore, could in a different sense remain a house of God, becoming a house of the poor. But I fear that COMECE the Catholic Church is a little bit like the European Union. So we have topics which belong to the COMECE, other topics belong to the bishops' conferences. And this is rather a topic which belongs to the bishops' conferences. But I think that the Council for Culture in Rome is also occupied with desacralization of churches. So they could give an input for that. And of course, we would give all our support for that and give the ball back to the bishops' conferences on this point.
Okay, thank you very much, Cardinal. There's another question for the panelists that maybe you could read. It's more comment, and I think we need to move on. I'm terribly sorry. We need to move on to the second session. But you know, I think Xavier Troussard, you mentioned that there's a conference on the 22nd and 23rd of April, and also this is we're in the design phase of this three phases, and we all have the opportunity to feed in and become partners in this process, which is really I suppose that is the radical proposition, isn't it? This co-creation from the so-called ground up. So thank you very much to those first three speakers, and for those of you, and indeed Cardinal Hollerich, for responding and those questions and comments. So session 2, it's terrible, one is in such a rush and all of this is so fascinating. I suppose this session of 4 presentations is best understood as a gathering of case studies, and by that I mean that each presentation is rooted in a very particular architectural situation. 2 presentations are to be given by academics and 2 by practitioners, architectural practitioners. Each presentation brings us to a different time and place, so we're moving through diverse histories and geographies, well, overwhelmingly 20th century, but they're all set alongside each other or joint somewhat by the connective tissue of the Catholic Church, in that they're all Catholic commissions or buildings for Catholic communities, or they are conceived of through the lens of Catholic social teaching. This last condition is certainly the case for the research of Professor Philip Bess, which is an ambitious proposal for a new city plan for Chicago, coming out of his award-winning teaching of the Notre Dame Graduate Urban Design Studio. In this presentation, we have Catholic social teaching, the principles of subsidiarity and solidarity overlaid onto a specific urban history and urban proposal. Philip Bess is tuning in or zooming in from America, a very different time zone. He's Professor of Architecture at the University of Notre Dame. He teaches urban design and theory with a particular interest in Catholic and classical humanist intellectual traditions, but in the context of contemporary American life and contemporary architecture and urban design. Professor Bess lectures widely, so we're lucky to have him here. He's the author of numerous articles and 3 books, and is a fellow of the James Madison Society of Princeton University and the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology in Berkeley. Thank you, Professor Bess. Your presentation has a long title. I'll give it a go because it's an imagined proposal. So here goes. After Burnham, that is Daniel Burnham, the Notre Dame Plan for Chicago 2109, a post-catastrophe Chicago imagined as an Aristotelian agrarian urban unit informed by Catholic social teaching. There you are now. Off you go.
All right, can everyone see this? Can you?
Yes, we can. We can,
Yes,
Professor
yes.
Bess.
Yes.
Okay, so. Is that better? Okay. Well, Ellen, I love how you pronounce, I love your pronunciation of Notre Dame with an Irish accent. Thank you. Thank you, Ellen. Thank you to my fellow panelists, and thank you to the conference organizers for inviting me to be with you this evening from across the pond, bringing some old, but I hope ever fresh ideas from the New World. At this moment in history, an authentic human ecology that both nourishes the human soul and is consonant with our vocation as stewards of creation seems a long-term cultural project that must occur largely in situ, a slow boring of hard boards. Let's see. Here we go. But some of the work of this project must surely be visionary. For the past decade, I've been working with students to imagine metropolitan Chicago at the bicentennial of Daniel Burnham's 1909 Plan of Chicago. Drawing on classical humanist traditions of architecture and urban design and the imperatives of Catholic social teaching, looking both backward and forward, our ambition has been to envision Chicago in 2109 as a flourishing agrarian urban unit, a neo-Aristotelian polis at metropolitan scale, but even at metropolitan scale characterized by beauty, solidarity, subsidiarity, environmental stewardship, and good law. A metropolis that both anticipates and sacramentally participates in the heavenly Jerusalem that is the goal of creation itself. The Chicago 2109 project was prompted by a general dismay at what today's most prominent architecture and urbanism have become. Also prompted by a specific sadness about Chicago as a global city with a globally recognized skyline, at the same time bleeding population and teetering on the abyss of financial insolvency into which it is surely going to plunge. And finally, by the tendentious ideological character of the Chicago architectural establishment's observance, I want to say lukewarm observance at best, in 2009 of the centennial of the Plan of Chicago. And so Chicago 2109 was undertaken for several reasons. First, to critique what Chicago had become 100 years after Burnham and Bennett's Plan of Chicago. Second,
sorry, Philip, excuse me for interrupting you. Are you able to move your slides on? Because we're still stuck on the first slide.
Really?
Yes, sorry about that.
Oh, wow. Because, yeah,
So
mine are moving. What do I need to do?
I don't know. Maud or Emilio, can you come to the rescue here?
Yeah, I'm about 5 or 6 slides in.
You could try to click on the down arrow that you see on your keyboard.
Yes.
That should
Yes.
do the game.
Is it moving now?
No.
No.
Try to get out of the view mode from your laptop.
I'm sorry.
Try of the PDF.
Oh, try to get out of the PDF. Okay. Do you want me? I'm in the PDF. Do you want me to close it and restart it?
Yes, please.
Okay. Let's see if I can find it now. Okay, so it's open again. Do you want me to share again?
Try, we see it again. Try to go down with the arrows now.
Okay. Okay.
Yes, it's moving.
Moving?
Okay. It's moving now. It's moving.
Okay.
Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you.
I'll put the view on the whole screen and see if it works. So is it moving now?
Yeah, well, if you move on to the next slide, we're on the Catholic Worldview slide with text.
Yeah.
Would you like to move on to the next one and we'll see?
I think it's a problem of the full screen. So maybe you can
okay. All right. I'll get out of that. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So
that's it. It's moving now. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Now I just have to change the all right. Okay, so here I was talking about the three things that had prompted the work on the plan. The first was to critique what Chicago had become 100 years after Burnham and Bennett's Plan of Chicago. The second, which is this slide, to critique the original plan of Chicago itself, and you can see here on the screen Daniel Burnham's dispatch from Purgatory. And third, to envision Chicago at the bicentennial of the plan and what Chicago might look like in 2109 by beginning with Chicago as it exists in the present, but guided over the next century by the holistic vision and classical humanist sensibilities of the 1909 Plan of Chicago as an authoritative reference point. I also thought at the time that Notre Dame School of Architecture was uniquely positioned to undertake a project of this sort, both because classical humanist architectural sensibilities were deeply embedded in the school, and because these sensibilities could be grounded in the sacramental culture and metaphysical realist assumptions of the larger university community, in which moral and cultural relativity do not completely reign, and where the objective character of beauty, goodness, and truth remain arguable propositions. The scale of the Chicago 2109 project causes many who first see it either to misunderstand or to mischaracterize it, most commonly to mistake it for a latter-day Robert Moses-like political proposal, entailing extensive condemnation of private property and forced shutdowns of post-1950 automobile suburbs. But this is not correct. Compared to the modernist planning hubris on display in Chicago in the 50s and 60s, Our Lady's Plan of Chicago 2109 is modesty itself. It takes no private land in either city or suburb. It condemns no existing buildings. Its narrative of the future is one of decline and revival, but the decline it presumes is already happening. Chicago's current culture of building is collapsing of its own weight, and Chicago 2109 presumes that post-war automobile suburbs in their current form will have definitively failed by the beginning of the 22nd century, primarily for two reasons. The first is demographic, related to consecutive generations of below replacement fertility rates that carry certain fixed demographic consequences that will become increasingly apparent as the baby boom generation dies off. The second is economic, having to do with suburban infrastructure and the cost of far-flung suburban roads and sewers far exceeding the financial capacity of suburbia's low population density tax base. This is not to say our cities are currently in great shape either, only that the kinds of changes we imagine require us to do something different than what we are doing now. Chicago 2109, thus, is not to be understood as a single big plan to be imposed from on high, but as a visionary framework to inspire 1,000 projects throughout metropolitan Chicago. Moreover, its fundamental sensibilities are necessarily modest. The 1909 plan of Chicago was conceived when Chicago was the fastest growing city in the world and very rich. Chicago 2109 is conceived in a time of shrinkage and scarcity, not to mention environmental degradation, of which Chicago has a long history. Chicago 2109 therefore demands prudential judgments, among them these: build on Chicago's strengths, especially existing rail transit and Chicago's proximity to fresh water and good agricultural land. Cut suburban losses and re-densify around commuter rail lines in known building and neighborhood types. Reclaim failed automobile suburbs as rural and agricultural landscape. Adopt form-based zoning codes to replace single-use zoning codes. Create a fairer and more equitable regional regime of land taxation that rewards agricultural and entrepreneurial activity and penalizes speculation in land. Tax land in all settlements at rates sufficient to pay for infrastructure. Still, although modest about methods, the scope and ambition of Chicago 2109 are holistic and comprehensive, addressing issues ranging from land use, shown here, to settlement type, size, density, form, and structure, to regional transportation and its relationship to land use, to storm and wastewater management specific to both the city of Chicago and the Metro Chicago region in two different systems, respectively, to recovery of in-city land lost to interstate highways, to historic regional housing types across an urban transect, and their effects upon regional and city population density and the recovery of natural and agricultural land. And finally, to the symbolic content of Chicago's formal order itself, addressed by a proposal to establish a north-south sacred cross-axis at the heart of Chicago's historic center that gives places of prominence for representative houses of worship from Chicago's existing religious communities, and is at the same time a physical embodiment in the public realm of America's historic principles of religious free exercise and non-establishment. Nobody involved with Chicago 2109 presumes achieving any of these ambitions would be easy. Nevertheless, we envision this kind of alternative developmental urbanism for Chicago because we believe the trajectories of secularist culture, the global economy, hypermodern architecture, and suburban sprawl are economically, environmentally, and anthropologically unsustainable. Pope Francis reminds us often in Laudato Si that everything is connected. He reminds us too that nature is most truly understood as creation, and that man as an intermediate being has a duty to steward nature with implications for both nature and for ourselves. Towns and cities are the primary way human animals occupy the landscape in order to flourish. If we are to have a decent future, it will most likely be in traditional towns and cities in which disciplined communities of faith create social and spiritual capital, and in which their buildings hold places of honor in the city's formal order. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip. You got through that despite all of those obstacles, and it's a beautiful presentation, visually very, very arresting. So thanks for sharing that. I might ask you to maybe stop sharing the screen, and we'll move on to, thanks a million, Philip. We'll move on to Anna Heringer, who is here with us now. Hi, Anna.
Hello,
Anna,
good evening.
Lovely to meet you. Anna is an architect who lives and works by the motto that architecture is a tool to improve lives. Wow, that slide works perfectly with the introduction. Her practice, Studio Anna Heringer, though based in Germany, is truly international, or no, global in ambition and reach, realizing projects across the world from Europe to Asia to Africa. She's probably best known for her work in earthen architecture and natural materials, and in development cooperation in Bangladesh. Her design for the wonderful Methi School in Rudrapur, Bangladesh from 2005 won her practice the Aga Khan Award for Architecture in 2007. She is now the Honorary Professor of the UNESCO Chair of Earthen Architecture, Building Cultures and Sustainable Development, and has been visiting professor and critic at various architecture schools from Harvard to TU Munich to ETH Zurich. Anna is going to discuss today projects in Bangladesh, a project in Ghana with Don Bosco, the campus of St. Michael that she's designing in Munich, touching on the potentials of earthen architecture, the spiritual element of sustainability, and the role of beauty in architecture. So thank you, Anna.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be here. The Catholic Church has been a wonderful partner for many of the projects, also the ones I'm showing today. Yes, Andy just mentioned architecture is, to me, a tool to improve lives. And of course, the opposite is also true. Unfortunately, architecture can also destroy lives. But I'm an idealist. I really believe we human beings can do better than now. And I firmly also believe that architecture is a very powerful tool for change. And we deal with lots of resources, we deal with lots of money and power. And we can use this power not just to build up a structure, but also to build up a fair society. And we can do this while we also do this in harmony with nature. And there are a lot of resources given by nature for free. And we all just need to have the sensitivity to see those resources and the creativity to use them. And this picture is the city of Shibam in Yemen, 500 years old. I mean, if this was possible that long ago, we should be able to do this today as well with all the technologies and the knowledge that we have. I went with 19 years old. I had the good luck to go to Bangladesh to be a development learner, the Bangladeshi NGO called Deepshika. And what I learned there is that the most important and effective strategy for development is always to really look at the potentials you have immediately around you and within you and try to make the best out of it without getting depending on external resources. And I transformed this then later on as an architecture student into my diploma project into a school in that very village where I spent almost a year. And in terms of materials, I didn't have to look far. They were right behind below my feet, the mud and the bamboo that was growing all around. So local materials are for me very essential in the work, and also local energy sources. When we think of alternative energies, we always think of solar, we think of wind, but in fact, the human energy, the crafts, the labor is also really a very important energy source, and it's a growing energy source. We have almost 7.8 billion people. And we know as human beings, we want to be also useful. We need some good work. So for me, local labor and creating work for communities is a very important part of my work too. This is the Methi School that I realized with together with Tighe Roswag, a Berlin-based architect. This is the school after 6 months of construction. It's a load-bearing earth walls without any cement added, only in the foundation, and then the bamboo roof on top. The ground floor is a very neutral classroom, and attached to it are caves. So I'm always trying to bring in archaic patterns in my designs and to react on very basic human needs, no matter where I'm building in the global south and in the global north. I think these patterns and needs are intercultural, interreligious, and important that we include those needs in our designs. That's the top floor, which is more related to the treehouse atmosphere. And the children all signed with the names at the doors of the Métis school, and they rightfully did so because they were also part of building the school. So every afternoon they were coming on the site. We had extra 2 teachers, Montessori teachers in our team to guide them on the site. And this inclusion is only possible because earth is wonderful to touch. You don't need any tools. You can do this with your hands only. So we had elderly people involved. We had children involved. We had people with disabilities involved, of course, men and women. And this aspect of real inclusiveness on the site is something that I really appreciate a lot on earthen structures. And I think you can all imagine how that feels after 6 months, you know, standing in front of that building as a small boy, as a small girl, or an illiterate day laborer who had never had the chance to be in his life in a school building. So in standing in front of the school and knowing that you built this with just using your hands and the mud below your feet, it is just really giving an enormous boost in your own confidence in the village itself, and of course also in the local materials that have usually a very bad image. I realized several buildings there, also together with students from Bangladesh and Austria mixed. And the last building I realized just last year is the Ananda Loy building. It's a center for people with disabilities on the ground floor, and on the top floor a fair textile manufacturer. And the building is kind of dancing around, so a ramp is dancing around the building, and it's kind of breaking out of the mold, out of the rectangular mold. And it's kind of a sign that it's good that we have a diversity, that people are all different, human beings are all different, and we're not just following the normal pattern. And that diversity is actually something to celebrate and is beautiful. So that's the therapy room and the ground floor, and under the ramp you also have the caves that create a very special atmosphere where children with disabilities and children from the village just meet in a very specific little kind of atmosphere where also, you know, the roads are not so clear, and it gives beautiful forms of interactions also. Some atmospheres from the building. That is the tailoring workshop of the women, and that enables the women to stay in the villages and not to migrate into the textile hubs in Bangladesh. And now we are going to the campus of St. Michael in Traunstein in Bavaria from the Diocese Munich-Freising, and it is planned in an earthen structure and in a timber structure. It's the place also where Pope Benedict got part of his formation. And I was very happy that the Catholic Church took really the responsibility here to go on new ways, because unfortunately, earth is still more expensive in our parts of the world, which is unlogic. You know, when I built in Bangladesh in that way, it's always the cheapest way to build. You know, take it in local materials, take it in crafts, building something. While when we do this here in Europe, it's the most expensive one. And every decision, you know, when it's this or that material, always the more sustainable one is the most expensive one. And this is for me really hard to experience. And that's also where I say we need to make a change in our political system, in our economic system, that we really carbon tax our materials and give a real price of the materials. Because of course, there is a lot of price and money also and involved in concrete structures. I mean, if you just think of rebuilding all the damages those kind of materials do on the planet. So these are just the ground floor plans. And of course, in Bangladesh, in Traunstein in Bavaria, you cannot build in the same way as you can build in Bangladesh. You need some sort of new technologies, just as prefabrication developed by my colleague Martin Rauch in Austria. And this is a mud factory, rammed earth factory, and this is how a building would look like. It's a Natura company in Germany by my colleagues Haas, Cook and Temmerich in Germany. Another project in Worms, where also together with Martin Rauch, I had the honor to build an altar, and we didn't want to bring in a ready-made structure, a ready-made altar in this 1,000-year-old cathedral, but we decided with the community, we're bringing the material, we're bringing the techniques, the knowledge, and the community comes together to build the altar together as a community. And it looked quite like this. So for 1 week, we turned really the sacred space into a construction site. And it was incredible, the team spirit that we experienced. It was the same element that we had in Bangladesh. You know, you build up a community while you build up a structure. And we also brought in historical parts of the city, also parts earth from different parts of the globe, also a little bit from the Vatican, just to show, you know, that we human beings, we are all connected through the same earth, through Mother Earth. So this is the altar, how it finally looked like. And for me, this is very symbolic. You know, you have all this beautiful gold in the background, and it's very much symbolic to our society. We're not lacking of materiality, we're lacking of good relationships and meaning. And this is something I think the church can bring in. Another project with Don Bosco in Ghana, supported with Austria and Ghana. This is the master plan that we got from Ghana. So following very much the scheme that, you know, the church has followed over decades, and also government organizations, non-government organizations, while I mean, you see the Catholic Church was very good in integrating local music, local textiles, and so on. But in terms of architecture, there's still something to do. On the right hand, you see the traditional culture. So we try to kind of transform this master plan into something that really integrates the cultures there. And I just flipped through some pictures. My site manager, Katharina Kohlrose, so we have a 100% woman quota in the office. Yes, we can. Priests also following. We also have Transolar new technologies included in those things. And these are the pictures just from 2 weeks back, how it is developing. And I really think, you know, from carbon neutral productions to socially fair implementation, earthen structures have a vital impact to help mitigating two of our largest global problems. And this is the climate change and it's the social injustice. And there are a lot of good looking architectures and structures all around, but we need more meaningful architecture and more beautiful architecture. And what is beauty to me? It is a formal expression of love. And if we do things out of love towards the planet, towards every being, and towards people, that means also we do it sustainably. So for me, the new mantra for new architecture, be it in Europe or be it in the global south, is form not follows function, but form follows love. Thank you.
Uh-oh.
Should I go on?
No, excuse me. I have this stupid telephone. That's just so inane. No, just so inane after that deeply, profoundly moving spiritual presentation you gave us that my stupid mobile phone kept dinging. No, I'm sorry. We would have loved to have kept listening forever and ever and looking. Wow, Anna, thank you so much. We must move on, but we will come back to discussion, and we have a couple of questions in the chat. So I'd urge the participants to put questions and comments about the inspiring nature or a query or a question. So thank you very much, Anna. That was really incredible. So moving on, I don't know if I should turn my alarm clock on again. It's quite an offensive thing. So moving on to the third of this session's presentations, although by this stage I probably sound sycophantic, but it really is exciting to have the artist and architect Damas Nwoko with us, and a privilege for me to introduce him. Damas is coming on camera now. Hi, Damas. Damas Nwoko comes from Nigeria and is one of the country's leading artists and certainly a pioneer of the modern movement in Nigeria, renowned for bridging Western traditions of his art training in Paris with Nigerian forms and narratives of his training with Zaria. He is a painter and sculptor, a professor of stage and set design, but for us today, because he is so polydimensional and multidisciplinary, we're thinking mostly about his architectural work, namely his commission for the Dominicans in the 1970s. Architecturally, Mr. Nwoko won his first competition in 1960 to design the National Arts and Crafts Pavilion during Nigerian independence celebrations in Lagos. And he's known for how he very expressively interprets architectural modernism through local building practices and materials. And that tendency and that art and expressionism is particularly evident in the example which you can see on the screen that he'll be talking about today, what I believe to be his truly magnificent Dominican Mission Chapel and Cultural Centre at Ibadan, Nigeria, from the mid to late 1970s. Thank you, Damas Nwoko. Yes, please, if you'd like to go ahead. Thank you.
Am I on?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much for having me. I have watched with great interest how the webinar has progressed. It seems that being the African on the program, obviously, I have to speak from the angle of an African and also a world citizen. Most of the historical materials that I've heard about Bauhaus and most other things happening in Europe, I think I'm very familiar with. My practice in Nigeria is predicated by a situation which we have found ourselves transiting from a very traditional cultural environment onto a mega city environment, meaning from a cultural society that is completely communal, and within a half a century have emptied into mega cities as in fact built and inhabited in most parts of other developed world. It is a problem that we have because the design discipline was very different in our rural setting, where it was highly democratized, meaning virtually everybody in the society participated in this creative activity that was very vital for the healthy sustenance of humanity in that environment. Suddenly, we were transported to cities where the designed environment is completely imported and executed with virtually imported materials, which has virtually no local input. This has typified what is happening even in the developed world, that mankind has been sort of stripped of his nature-given path to play in the husbanding of God's own creation. The process of building of a city or a town is now fractured and divided into two incoherent parts. One is one which is built, in fact, designed from abroad, and then awarded to contractors from abroad, and then they set up this downtown environment, which the local populace has absolutely no part in. Then the second part moves them to the area of the cities where they inhabit. Most of the inhabitants have moved straight from their local environment in villages right to the cities. In the local environment in the villages, habitat was built by a cooperative type of action. Everybody participated. Everybody put in play their own skills. They had different skills. So it is not different from the labor force that you find in the big cities, because there are masons, there are carpenters, there are welders, that is not the disruptive part, because even in the local setting, everybody contributed their own part. I've been living in my village for over 40 years and 50 years, and I have designed and put up public buildings like churches, and I used the same cooperative method that was indigenous. So, which means that instead of awarding the building of these big churches to contractors, we made every member of the church who had a skill to contribute their skill. One, it was very, very sustainable because they were able to build these structures that they couldn't have built if they were to contribute money and hire a contractor. So when they moved out of this village into town, what I found is that in our big city like Lagos, every individual who had to build still felt that he could build his house himself in the way it was done in the village. But what we found now is because of the lack of social cohesion in the city, the results have been very appalling. Building or the arts, the design, architecture, or all the arts is a very is the base of a spiritual experience for all humanity, and their participation is very vital because they had the opportunity to contribute their own skill and their own creativity. But in a situation where there is no such social participation, the individual is forced to use whatever is presented. My experience is that what is presented today is very sterile, lacking in any artistic creativity. this artistic creativity doesn't mean a drawing or painting or sculpture. In the shape of the building, in the material you use in the building, all that influence the effect the building has on every individual. So we find that it is very essential that this element in architecture, in art, is very vital to the healthy sustenance of humanity. My works have tried to take those elements of aesthetics that come from our culture. And when I have used it in my design and building, the result has been very, very phenomenal, that everybody that uses the building find a type of peace, which is highly spiritual. And also, they are drawn to these artistic edifices. But the general run of the other buildings that are built in the modernistic style with industrial materials and sort of built without any type of communal participation, seem to leave the individual that use this building looking inward only to themselves, because there's nothing in the new churches that really would remove their mind from themselves. The only thing that they can focus on is their next door neighbor in the church. And since, in fact, their activity is centered on themselves, I find that the activities in these sterile buildings that doesn't have art and doesn't have materials that they can identify with as having grown out of nature, have become devastating. I'm very familiar with the history of a Bauhaus. They had to move away from the highly artistic architecture of Europe. It was all right for an environment where the whole place was really full of these edifices, beautiful artistic edifices. So they moved away and sort of discouraged the profusion of art in say, architecture, and concentrated on the economy of the buildings. What that has done is to really rob man of his only opportunity to participate in the husbanding of his environment. And the effect is very clear in Europe. Now, my problem coming from Africa is that we seem to have inherited this sterility from Europe. So we've grown from the natural environment where humanity tried to imitate nature in its creativity and were involved in husbanding nature, which I think was the injunction by God after he created the world. Now, we now have an environment that is not sustainable. the modern buildings are not affordable to the average to the average citizen. They are in fact out of their reach. In fact, most of these new buildings in cities where they have migrated to are mostly empty because few people can afford it. So we now find that humanity is now living in very unhealthy slum atmosphere, which when they were in the village, they could do something about it. They could change it. And housing was ample. So it is a problem to us in Africa to even build our new environment. It's not so much a problem in Europe where virtually every place has been built up. But it is really tragic to us in Africa that we can't even build the infrastructure of our environment. So, do we throw in the towel? What would I say? Follow what is the trend all over the world, and and perish. If one looks at what design I've tried to do, I have found that the reaction of everybody that uses the building or enters the building is the same thing, whether you are from Europe or you are from Africa or you are from Asia. So there is that, I believe, that line of art in architecture, art in design. Art is essential to our spiritual being. We still have space to build in Africa. But the pressure on us from the West with industrial economy.
Sorry.
Yes.
Sorry for interrupting. We would just ask you to just round up your presentation, if you may, because then we have time constraints for the rest of the speakers.
We'll see.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Nwoko. We still have another speaker. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Will we finish up there and move on to Marie-Yvonne Proveaux and then come back for a discussion? If you don't mind, is that okay, Mr. Nwoko? Thank you very much for that presentation.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Sorry to stop you midstream. It's the brutality of the 10-minute limit, you know. One has to be slavish to the clock, as we heard my mobile phone.
Okay, and thank you for really having me. I found it very useful.
Well, we're privileged, and I was watching a YouTube video of that Dominican church the other day, and I'd recommend everyone look at it. It's a gorgeous journey, looking at the crucifixes. It's really beautiful, the windows. But let us go on to the fourth speaker, the last speaker today, and thank you, Mr. Nwoko. So, can I? Last but not least, thank you for your patience, Marie-Yvonne Proveaux. Our final presentation is from Professor Marie-Yvonne Proveaux, who is a historian by training and senior lecturer in town planning at Polytech Lille in the north of France. She researches around the subject of French urbanism from the 50s to the 1980s and is an associate of the research centre Territoire, Ville, Environnement et Société. She's here speaking to us in relation to her book, Catholicisme, Social et Urbanisme, Maurice Ducroux et la Fabrique de la Cité. Excuse my French accent, Irish French. Her Hiberno French. Her presentation is focusing on this figure, Father Ducroux, and the architectural housing projects and practice along the peripherique of Paris by esteemed socialist architect Jean-Claude Tighe of the 1970s. So thank you, Marie-Yvonne Proveaux.
For inviting me and good evening to all of you, and apologize for my non-fluent English. So you already said many things, so I'm going to start now. Yes, Maurice Ducreux was established in Ivry-sur-Seine as a member of the Mission de France after the World War II. And he became a knowledge worker within the Bureau d'études and de réalisation urbaine, the BERU. The BERU was the most important and successful private consultancy in urban planning and development in France, but also abroad. And in the 50s, co-op housing was already trendy, and the vocation to which Maurice Ducreux was dedicated was not the traditional parochial ministry, but the fight against poor quality housing through analysis of the decent housing needs of working class municipalities. I can say that from a sociology of souls, Ducreux turned to a humanistic town planning. Both SACMA and SINAM, two firms close to the economy and humanism, the Joseph Lebre's movement, launched similar mechanographical and mapping processes to treat pastoral inquiries and urban renovation surveys at much the same time. Passionate about statistics, Maurice Ducreux has taken a very active part in these data acquisition and processes. Sorry, I don't.
Well, you're not able to move on your slides, Marie-Yvonne. Is that the problem?
No,
Can Maud or Emilio assist us here in that?
Okay.
Oh,
yes, I want to briefly focus on 3 professional experiences in which Maurice Ducreux was involved because of the relevance of the themes and approaches addressed regarding to the previous presentation. In these experiences, Maurice Ducreux has made deep intellectual friendship with 2 Jesuit figures, Léon de Saint-Moulin first in Kinshasa, and Jean Lacan, with whom Maurice Ducreux shared daily life in the working class and immigrant neighborhoods of Ivry-sur-Seine. I don't, okay. The intellectual aura of Léon de Saint-Moulin, who died recently, whether in theology or advanced urban studies in Belgium or in Democratic Republic of Congo, is much stronger than that of Maurice Ducreux, who was a self-taught man, but their collaboration and friendship were intense and lasting. Because Maurice Ducreux was seconded to the French urban planning mission as a technical cooperation officer in 1967. And as you can see on the right side of the screen, in addition to the Jesuit Léon de Saint-Moulin, the list of collaborators included another Jesuit figure, Joseph Boutte, and another member of the Mission de France, Emmanuel de Vévrotte. And this list also include Congolese public structure or public enterprise like National Bank or the transport company Otraco, because they were ones who provided the most modern means, especially the mechanographic processing of the survey or the aerial coverage by the Geographical Institute of Congo. The purpose of the survey was mapping the territory of Kinshasa, gained by spontaneous urbanization as a tool to guide urban planning authority. And as you can see, the age of the neighborhood could be read through the density of its habitat and the size of its trees. And this was also the role of photo interpretation, as you can see on the screen. And the aerial coverage and photo interpretation were coupled with a field a rigorous field survey. What we can learn from this major socio-demographic survey, I think first is the positive complementarity between the profane and the religious, the academic world, because Joseph de Saint-Moulin was member of the FNRS, was yes, a researcher, and the operational world too. I think it's a very multidisciplinary and approach which mixed methodology in geography, urban and pastoral statistical surveys, and urban studies. And I want to focus on one point. Even today, many demographic, epidemiological, or environmental survey, like measuring deforestation, for example, or desertification, continue to combine statistical survey and satellite remote sensing, for example. Many methods that Léon de Saint-Moulin and Maurice Ducreux started to use at that time. Second themed, urban renewal and struggle for decent housing. And I borrow the title, When the Modern Was Not a Style But a Cause, from Anatole Kop's major book. On the first cover page, you can see on the screen, you can see a famous Bauhaus neighborhood, probably Semenstadt. Anatole Kop was one of the main consulting architects of the Beru. But Maurice Ducreux also collaborated a lot in Ivry-sur-Seine or Rouen and its suburbs with the founding architects of the Atelier de Montrouge, Jean Renaudy, Pierre Riboulet, Gérard Tarnauer, Jean-Louis Verret, and of course, René Geloustet in Ivry-sur-Seine. All of them already had in common the experience of slums, whether in the Paris region, in Algeria, or in Morocco, and all shared the same aspiration for an integral urbanism, for adequate housing and a community life that puts people and their aspirations at the center of the reflection. Here is an example of one of the very rigorous and comprehensive housing surveys that Maurice Ducreux and the Beru have made a specialty of. On the other side, the maps made in partnership with the Atelier de Montrouge about the overcrowded, unhealthy housing situation in Rouen. To be honest, at that time, Maurice Ducreux's preoccupations were more concerned with hygiene than with heritage, but his collaboration and readings with Paul-Henri Chambardelot, Robert Rosel, Michel Coy, the Atelier de Montrouge, as I said previously, led him to be deeply interested in all the dimensions of the act of building. And the will to give a subjective and more human dimension to architecture and urbanism was a characteristic feature of the International Congress of Modern Architecture's post-war reflection, and especially for the Atelier de Montrouge, with which he worked a lot. Third point, what can we learn from this deep interest in all the phases of the act of building and living? I think it's the plea for a coherent land and property policy in order to propose a real human right to housing, the primacy of the human scale and the rights of individuals, and the will to engage a general process of humanization of the city in order to promote the opportunity of expression of its inhabitants and to allow them to take an active part in the social life. And I think that these concerns that you can see on the screen are still relevant today in a sustainable perspective that is ours this evening. Third, and quickly, the third point is the commitment of Maurice Ducreux and Jean Lacan, the second Jesuit figure, into the movement against racism and friendship between people, the title I choose is Looking at the Center with the Eyes of the Peripheries. Maurice Ducreux was very concerned about the growing feeling of disappropriation of these industrial urban spaces in disrepair. He also pointed out the changes in the population which accentuated the presence of captive categories with low resources, elderly people or immigrants especially. And what we can learn from this benevolent view of immigrants in the context which is ours today, the context of structural, economic and geopolitical crisis, is putting welcome and human dignity at the forefront of our concern. The continuing urgency of housing for immigrant family and new migrants, and the fight against urban ghettos, and for a true social mix that is not politically instrumentalized. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Proveaux. That was marvelous, beautiful images, and just in time for my clock to go. Well, we have run out of time, and I fear a lot of people in European time are late for their dinner because we've lost a few participants, which is okay. Stefan has put his email address into the chat, and we invite feedback from people that they weren't able to make in person to that email, and to be assured that we will be presenting kind of the musings, reflections, findings of this webinar to the new European Bauhaus at this design phase, this initial phase. There is this uncanny common thread from this session where there's this call for a way back to where we can be involved in the making of our environments, of our cities, of our villages, from the self-build, the inclusivity at the building, but certainly at the design phase. So I think that's extremely interesting. And there is this call, I suppose, a plea, and it might sound nostalgic, but it's not, for community. And that's coming from Laudato Si right through all of this. It's terribly interesting. Do the contributors have a spontaneous reaction to what they've just heard? Is anyone bursting and bubbling to share their response to what they've heard from the speakers? As in, do any of you speakers have anything you'd like to? Philip.
Yeah, so one of the things that struck me certainly about a couple of the presentations in particular is this kind of collision course between modern methods and materials of construction and the embodied energy that is represented in such buildings, and generally that they tend not to be as durable as blocks of earth piled up on top of each other, which I love the project that Anna started out with, that it was a 500-year-old village. So it just seems to me there's a kind of collision course with respect to environmental concerns and sustainable building, that to some extent the most durable kinds of buildings seem to be made with low embodied energy buildings, or low embodied energy materials that come most directly from the earth, right? That have the least, they're the closest, they're built in conditions of scarcity and proximity, and they require relatively little refinement to create them and you know, to get them ready for building. It's just an interesting issue, I think, with respect to localism and with respect to low embodied energy building and durability and sustainability. So this is actually something that I didn't have time to talk about with respect to the Chicago project, but I'm very happy that it came up in Anna's presentation and also Damas's presentation, and others kind of hinted at it. So I just wanted to mention that. So thank you.
Well, you kind of do talk about it when you talk about water, you know, and the proximity of Chicago to water, and
yeah,
you know, that needs to be harnessed, you know, and that's the wastewater, the wetlands, the reinstatement of wetlands.
Yeah.
So yeah. Yeah, but there is a collision between this rationalism that Marie-Yvonne's talking about, that statistical study, and then this community and this hyper-local. And Anna, have you got this, just to read out in terms of, for Anna Heringer there, that people were really wowed by this thing of form follows love. That's really inspiring, and you know, so I just wanted to say that thanks for making that link and such. And Minta, you were going to speak there.
Yeah, I just also want to make a quick comment. It's also in reference to Anna Heringer's presentation, because what I really liked was that you had this nice phrase, socially shared building. I think this is very important, and this relates to the debate we had in the first section. It's not only developing concepts and talking about whatever sustainable materials and new concepts of housing and urban planning, but this concept of socially sharing and sort of integrating the people, and this kind of bottom up movement. And this is where I also see the contrast to the Bauhaus. I mean, this is what I meant by hegemonic decisions made by the Bauhaus, and this what Anna Heringer presented was this kind of collective event and socially sharing. And I just think this is very important to make any kind of initiative successful. So thank you very much for this also very nice phrase you mentioned.
Thank you, Anna. Yes, I strongly believe that the process is just as important as the outcome. And in architectural education, we always learn to design the outcome, but we don't learn to design the processes. And I think the social power is very much linked to the process. And you know, when I'm working here in Bangladesh or here in Germany or Switzerland or whatever, people are people, and human beings are human beings. We all have the same needs, and we want to build up something. I mean, it's in our DNA. Every child is building some hut, and the biggest fun, of course, is to do it together. And now in our parts of the world, we have delegated this joy of making and building our own nests, I would say, or our own habitat. We have completely delegated it and are detached from that. And I think, you know, it unites us as a community again if we all have the same aim, and we have to take an effort to reach this aim, you know. And here we always think participation is just decision making. You know, we can be part of decision making, but that also implies a hierarchy between the intellect versus the hand, the manual work. And I very much feel on the sides, you know, that this collaborative working hand in hand and also the non-verbal communication is helping a lot to shape good communities.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Could we have a word from Xavier Troussard, please?
Yes, I was about to comment because I was also impressed both by the very concrete examples of projects of architecture, which were processes and community building as much as building spaces, and it deeply echoes what we are collecting. I was telling that we have received hundreds of contributions, and when we analyze them, when we look at what people find inspiring, they do not come up with just a nice shape. They come with the story that comes with it, either the story of how it's been co-created one way or another, or the story of the life it has allowed. And so I think that's what we have to really look at, is these new European Bauhaus. It's not just about architecture as a shape, it's about how we co-create the spaces in which we live and the type of life that we can bring into it. And I think those examples that Anna has brought, and also the motto she has coined, I think is very inspiring for the new European Bauhaus. So thank you for this.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Xavier Troussard there. So Bishop Paul Tighe, you've been waiting patiently and I'm sure enjoying all of that. You will conclude our fascinating webinar. You are eminently qualified to do so as the Secretary of the Pontifical Council for Culture. You come from Ireland, where you work tirelessly in the area of communications and public affairs for the Dublin Diocese. So thank you, Bishop Paul.
Great. I'd just like to conclude by thanking all our panelists for what I have found to be a most enjoyable discussion. I mean, both the degrees of, I had intended at the beginning trying to summarize each person, but I don't want to keep you here all night and repeat everything, but just 1 or 2 points that I would like to make. One is that recently I was reading a book by Ulrike Müller, Women of the Bauhaus, and the Bauhaus theory that apparently women could work in 2 dimensions, but not in 3. And I'm delighted that our panel this day has certainly disavowed us of any kind of wrong understanding. So we do need this broader understanding. One of the things that I remember at the time I was reading Laudato Si was, in many ways, it begins, you think it's an easy document, and then you realize it's quite complex because the Pope wants to bring out the interconnectedness of so many things and our dependence on the environment in which we live. And I felt that that point came out from our 3 original speakers, that this sense of how do we recognize we're all in this together? We have to work together. The resolutions we need to bring together are the contributions not just of architects, but of economists, politicians, to address different issues that are priority for us in creating an environment that is sustainable, that is life-giving, that offers beauty and hope to people. And at that same time as I was reading Laudato Si, I was reading a novel by an American novelist called Bern Lerner, 1004, which is about artists and the role of the artist. And he has this extraordinary meditation where he's walking back across Brooklyn Bridge and he looks at Manhattan and sees Manhattan as a living unity. And he asks what his role as an artist could be there. And he talks about recognizing that in a good and happy city, we lose our sense of individuality. We see how we can contribute to the communality, to that which is bigger than all of us, and that the life of the city is something to which we can make a contribution. And that's, I think, a huge thing, to ask, how can we contribute to making our environment a healthier, more enjoyable environment? Just 2 or 3 points I think I'd like to pick up on. One is, been reading a lot recently, I think the problem of how do we, and I recognize the commitment to making this as inclusive a process as possible, but how do we think about inclusivity at a time when inequality is out of control? And when so much of what we do with the best wind in the world is conditioned by social and political factors rooted in existing inequalities and likely to be perpetuated by what's coming at us. I think in that sense of recently reading again Alec McGillis, a book called Fulfillment, and he talks about not just the inequality, social inequality, but regional inequality. We are now getting a situation where there will be cities for the rich and cities from the poor, which will have their own problems. The cities for the rich won't be able to provide places for people who offer the services that keep our cities alive. And this has become so obvious at the time of the pandemic. The cities of the poor become ghettos where people are asked to live in environments that are not really sufficient for their dignity. Another interesting study recently from Britain, the Nuffield Centre, showing the mapping you can make between areas of urban poverty and food deprivation. And it's not about people not having the right approaches. It's actually about people not having the food available to them because the cities don't work to distribute fresh food to certain parts of our cities. And again, I can imagine that being exacerbated by those of us who are lucky enough to be able to call in for what we need, whereas those who have to find it locally and the only things on offered are unhealthy offerings. I think related to that, just an issue that again, I think we need to look at is this one, the notion in cities and environments generally, not just cities, but of how do we age in place? How do cities enable people a continuity of continuing to live in environments where they belong to a community as they age, where their immediate contribution and functional terms to the city may no longer be as strong? How do we think about that? One thing I'd recommend to everybody is Pope Francis, obviously in Laudato Si, but in an extraordinary personal reflection he did in Madison Square Gardens about the life of the city. And he talks about cities and the wonders of cities where people come together and learn to bring and to become places of encounters between people. But he also talks about the forgotten, those who are not included in cities, those who, he says, almost have no right to exist, the poor, the homeless, those who don't have insurance. How do we think about a truly inclusive vision as we build our cities together? And just to pick up on something that came up earlier, I think that's an issue here at the Council. We've been looking at questions about church architecture. How do we build, and I think we have to think about the future, how do we build types of churches that offer something to our cities? Very often churches are the few buildings that are open, that are not subject to a charge, that have things of beauty within them. How do we keep that alive in terms of that our churches are not just closed off from our cities, but in a sense, the spirit of our church is able to enliven the life of the city? One of the principles, I think, then is when we think of buildings that are no longer necessary in terms of their cultic, religious dimensions, as they are, maybe populations no longer require direct churches. How do we think about repurposing those buildings in ways that they remain places for people, open to people? One of the things I think in that very strongly at the moment, how could our churches become places where people gather in a polarized society, where we can sponsor the type of interaction and meeting of people that is so necessary for a healthy democracy? Related to that, I think one example that struck me from Britain recently was the number of the cathedrals that have become centers for the distribution of the vaccines, and how in the midst of this distribution of the vaccine, you had the use of the organ to provide music, to enliven. So church is becoming spaces that are still something to offer. And I think very particularly that, as I agreed with Cardinal Hollerich, we don't have the jurisdiction to decide, but church is becoming the house of God in place of place of sanctuary, a place of quiet for those who need peace and recollection, a place of sanctuary for those who have no roof over their head, that we make them truly buildings that contribute to the life of our cities, to the life of our people, particularly to those who are most disadvantaged. So thank everybody involved today for their contributions. I'm sorry we couldn't interact more, but hopefully in the fullness of time, we will find ourselves together again with the possibility for ever richer exchanges and the side conversations that would be so welcome. And I'd just like to, in the name of Cardinal Ravasi, thank COMECE for their initiative here. And it's wonderful to be able to do a joint initiative such as this. So thank everybody very much. And I wish all those who have been with us all the best. And from here, good evening, and thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we may conclude now, and Stefan Lunte tells me that there is to be a follow-up in November normally. So I don't know if that's something to do with another one of these gatherings, but we can all conclude that that was very encouraging and very inspiring. So thank you one and all. COMECE, Stefan Lunte and Emilio will get on back to all the speakers privately, but for now I'd like to wrap it up and say thank you very much and goodbye, good evening.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.